morning, or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are joining us from, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kalina from Business Review, and I will be your host today. It is our pleasure to have QPS with us today, who will be presenting this webinar titled Clinical Decisions, Applying Advanced Optimization Data. Today's guest speakers are Patrick Homer, Global Life Sciences Commercial Practice Principal at SAS, and John Mosanti, Senior Vice President and Head of Clinical Business Development at QPS. I would like to welcome you to our webinar platform on 24. You will notice that this webinar is browser-based, so if you disconnect for any reason, please just click on the link that you received via email to rejoin the session. In order to ask any questions, please use the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top corner of your screen and click Submit. Towards the end of this session, we will allocate some time to address any questions or thoughts that you may have. Please also use the yellow help widget if you require any assistance, and you can move, resize, and maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. But now, please allow me to welcome John Mosanti. John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kalina. Good morning, folks, or good afternoon, wherever the case may be. I want to, on behalf of Patrick and I and QPS and SAS, thank you for joining us in today's conversation. Hopefully, you'll find the topic both interesting and a little bit thought-provoking. I know that he and I have spoken at great length about it. I want to just kind of set the stage a little bit before we turn this over to Patrick and discuss what we're calling the launch planning conundrum. We have a lot of issues in our industry, obviously. A couple that really come to mind for this particular talk is the pricing pressures that we as an industry face. Pharma and biotech companies all across the globe deal with both government and public pressures to manage pricing of their products better. And we have another issue that for those of us who are on the clinical development side deal with, which is the continuing increase in clinical development cost. And when you add these two cost issues together, the downward pressure on pricing and the increasing cost of clinical development, that has a great deal of impact on our margins. And these margins are the free dollars that we have available to reinvest in other new cutting edge technologies that so many people pour their heart and souls into year after year. We see in a company who is headed towards commercialization that there's an ongoing collaboration that occurs between the clinical teams and those on the marketing and commercial side. At some point in time, conversations usually take place that allow the two teams to discuss the primary and secondary clinical endpoints and what value those endpoints have and represent to the patient, because at the end of the day, that's what we're all in it for, is to deal with some rather nefarious diseases and illnesses that afflict a lot of folks. At that very same time in the life cycle of this product, market access becomes a topic of conversation, and there's a lot of money spent. I've personally been involved in market access programs, and just for the states alone, you can put a lot of money into trying to understand the government issues and the pricing issues and the commercialization challenges that you're going to face. And so you have to give very careful consideration to that. And coupled with that, we're looking at this orchestrated effect of when we can launch a particular product in a particular market. And final decisions have to be made around the access and meeting the regulatory requirements of the governing body within that country and within states, even here in the United States. So this orchestration and this timing and all the inputs that we have to deal with, we do a very good job, I think, of trying to determine the best approach. But there's some possible ways that we can utilize analytics to make a more informed decision. And that decision that can be made will help us to better sequence that launch, identifying which countries are more important as an initial launch of a product versus others as it applies to market baskets. And that's really what we're going to talk about today, is does the current process that we're working under contribute to the problem? And when you think about it, global commercial input looks at the product profiles. It looks at the competitive landscape. We do a lot of digging into the valuation of the indication and the patients and the dosing and and in some instances, the supply chain and how to get it to the individual. There are these local pricing pressures that we've mentioned. And then there's that element of time to approval in the market. And we do know that if we started 6 projects in 6 different countries all today, they may not all get approved at the same time. And that, I think, introduces the endless combination of launch sequencing, because we have to make decisions on what is the easiest way to the market, what is the fastest way to the market, what is the right price. We're no way here encouraging or suggesting predatory pricing, but we're suggesting the right price for a product that represents the time, effort, and cost of going into developing the drug and getting it to market and taking care of the patient properly. And then the timing as it relates to those decisions. And what we have seen is that even the smallest of variations can have very significant fluctuations in the prices on the market and the return that we can realize that would then allow us to make reinvestments. And today's discussion with Patrick Homer, my colleague, is the utilization of an analytical tool that they provide that can improve modeling accuracy and save time. So that's what we're really headed towards today, and hopefully you'll have some new thoughts leading out of this. So we've made the comment that reference pricing can muddy the water, and we're not now just reflecting on the pricing in that process in foreign countries. This is an evolving landscape. You have to identify which are the key countries you need to go to market in. Certain countries pose more significant risks than others. And these pricing strategies must accommodate all of these challenges and all of these issues, and do so in a very methodical and proper way. And the reference pricing scenario planning matrix looks at that from a statistical design. It's a highly efficient modeling process. It works to take into consideration all the inputs across many countries, and it makes a determination as when is the time to engage in market access discussions. And is the current approach that your company or we as an industry are using, is it the most accurate time? Or are there ways to improve it and optimize those discussions? Kalina, if you wouldn't mind taking the audience through the first of the polling questions, that would be great.
Certainly. Thank you very much, John. Indeed, the first polling question in today's session and the answers to it are: does the clinical development team engage in launch pricing discussions with the marketing team? Yes. And if yes, please select the development stage when these discussions occur: phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. Or another possible answer to this question is no. Please select the answer that is relevant to you and click submit. Let's give the audience members a couple of seconds to vote on this one. So 100% of the audience members have voted yes. And then again, 100% of the audience members have voted for phase 3. We will run another polling question, which is: what data has the greatest influence on deciding the global country launch sequence of a new drug product? And the possible answers are pricing, market access, restrictions, formularities, etc., regulatory approval timelines, market size, anticipated competition, or other. Please select the one answer that is relevant to you and click submit. So here we have 100% voting for regulatory approval timelines. And another polling question that we have for you is: who has the greatest influence of launch market sequence? Marketing team, clinical development team, market access team, pricing or forecast team, or other? Again, similarly, please select the relevant answer and click Submit. So we have 44.4% of the audience members voting for marketing team, then 22.2% for clinical development team, another 22.2% have voted for market access team, and 11.1% for pricing or forecast team. Thank you all very much for voting. We will now continue the presentation with Patrick Homer. So Patrick, over to you.
Well, thank you, Kalina. And so, John, thanks for the introduction too. And I just want to say another thank you as well for inviting me as a guest to join you on today's webinar. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, also a good evening. Thanks for joining us. John, I think you've set up the foundation very, very nicely here, exploring launch planning conundrum and how the current process contributes towards a problem. So in this next section, anyway, I want to take you on a voyage of discovery where we're going to understand and explore how decisions made in the stages coming to launch could have a significant, and I underline that word, significant impact across the whole of the product life cycle, driven predominantly by the implications of IRP, International Reference Pricing. We'll explore what some of the best practices are, and about some of the questions as well about integrating some of those decisions and insight earlier on. I think, the polls are very useful to see that sort of phase 3 is when most of these decisions started to take place. I guess the question that, the rhetorical question to ask is that, is there any value in doing this at an earlier stage? So over the next 15, 20 minutes, I'll say we're going to sort of be looking at unfolding the IRP problem in sort of further detail, how the landscape continually changes and evolves, and a very important sort of dynamic here, to explore what is the complexity behind the launch sequence, trying to achieve the true optimization in launch sequencing, and then sort of reflect on that discussion and sort of try and drive some conclusions out of that. So part 1, understanding the IRP problem. And in the chart in front of us, if we take a look at the left-hand side, that during the sort of launch sequence planning and during the development phase, as we said, usually at phase 3, companies now start to think about, taking the products to the global theater, which countries we're going to launch in, and the order of those launches, seeking out marketing authorization, the approval, and then submitting for pricing and reimbursement. Now, what we see is that when the first country is launched and through to the end of the sort of the full launch cycle, which, from experiences that we've had working with companies, can take anywhere up to sort of 5 years, with a peak in there of around sort of years 3 of where the majority of launches are now sort of coming underway. But it can take a good 5 years process to complete sort of a full execution of a launch sequence. One of the factors that we see highlighted in the sort of the bottom blue line is price erosion. Now, price erosion occurs from sort of 2 factors and sort of 2 dynamics that are driving it. Firstly, it's the globalization side, is that we're launching into some markets where the prices are going to be high, and we're going to be launching into some markets where the prices are not going to be so high. So we've got a dilution of the average price as the more countries start to unfold that we've launched into. And there's nothing we can do about this. It's a nature of sort of globalization and the affordability of sort of countries. But there's also another dynamic that's associated with this, and that part of the price erosion is caused by the complexities of international reference pricing. And we know that if we sort of take a more considered, a more precise plan and methodology for launch sequencing, we can achieve the sort of the line that's above the bottom line, by reducing that price erosion by a technique called launch sequence optimization. Now, this is highly valuable, a highly valuable exercise to undergo of trying to achieve this sort of this optimization. And the reasons being is that as we start to look about, through the launch itself and through the rest of the life cycle, 2 of the value drivers that we can attain is about the ability to be able to increase revenue during the launch phase through optimization, and then the ability to be able to create a sustained price increase when we finish the launch that then sort of maintains throughout the rest of the sort of product life cycle. So within here, even small gains over the rest of the sort of the product life cycle and revenues generated can have really, really significant sort of implications going forward. So the benefits to sort of companies, what they're sort of trying to do in this phase is that the prices that they've been able to maintain and sort of negotiate through the pricing reimbursement is trying to sort of keep those from sort of degrading because of a result of international reference pricing. And then the order in which you launch has a sort of significant impact upon the ability to be able to do that. So let's go into the next phase of trying to sort of unravel this and try to get an understanding in more detail about international reference pricing and what it actually does and how it contributes towards this problem. So in front of us, we've got a sort of a tree diagram, a matrix, where we've got, in this case, it's Ireland at the sort of the top of the basket, the top of the pyramid. And Ireland has its reference baskets by as indicated by those countries in the next level below. Austria, sort of Belgium, Denmark as an example here, as some of the countries that make up the sort of reference basket. Now, when a price is set within Ireland, because of these other countries' reference towards Ireland for the price there, is that they have the ability to be able to take on a resemblance of the price that has been negotiated within the Irish markets. And that price can then sort of, an element of that price can get then cascaded down into those countries which are in Ireland's reference baskets. The process gets further complicated because those reference countries also have reference basket as well. And so, and if we start to then expand the problem anyway, that's just Ireland and looking at its reference basket and its other reference baskets. If we looked at the whole of the EU as an example here, we can clearly see that that the problem becomes a very tangled matrix of creating interdependencies on decisions that are made in pricing in individual countries. And what we can see is that the top half of this diagram, the diagram on the left-hand side, is that all of those countries are very highly connected. So if you change a price, change a launch date within those countries, there's a potential that that could have a major implication on some of the other markets that are in the top half. The bottom half, well, those you can see that there are lesser connections between those countries because they are not so connected through international reference pricing. And the likelihood of making a sort of a pricing change, it may not have that so much of an effect. So we need to be sort of very much mindful about not only a reference basket, is that how the whole matrix sort of comes together. The next part is that countries have reference baskets, but also those reference baskets have rules. Those countries have rules of the formula that they then apply to be able to determine the pricing metric. Now, altogether, we've discovered and we work with over sort of 20 different rules that sort of govern sort of different pricing mechanisms. It could be sort of taking the average price of a reference basket. It could be taking 90% of the average price of a reference basket. It could be taking the lowest of a reference basket, et cetera, et cetera. But altogether, sort of 20 plus different variations of rules. And those rules also have rules about the timing before a sort of a pricing metric will then sort of come to fruition. After the sort of a pricing event takes place, it may be 3 months, it may be 6 months, maybe 12 months before that rule is then invoked. So we started to paint this picture about sort of the complexity that now starts to unfold with the international reference pricing. So what market access global pricing will try to do in this in these phases is we're trying to attain this sort of top line, the reduced price erosion via optimization. And the levers that they have at their disposal is really about, trying to determine the launch order, the optimized launch sequence. Which countries are you going to go in and which order of the launch? The timing is also critical, and the prices that you've attained there are also sort of critical in trying to understand how a price can cascade all the way through this system. And being able to follow this metric if companies can, of what is going to happen to the average global price, enables companies to make the best decisions about bringing a product to market. At this stage, I also want to reflect that, it's not only about the launch market where international reference pricing has a significant impact. It also occurs within what we call the in-market phase. Now, this is the phase when a product has been fully launched across the whole of the global theatre. There are no more countries in which to launch into. But different events are now going to start happening and shaping the rest of the product life cycle. For example, there could be mandated price reductions, government-mandated price reductions in a country. And that mandated price reduction is not just going to affect that sort of country because of the connected nature. It is going to have this implication across other countries as well. Competitive entry, so new products might come into the market or products going completely generic. That may affect the long-term sort of affordability of your original product. So again, within that country, you may need to make a modification in that price. And making that modification in the price could have a significant impact across other countries too. And also the ability to be able to sort of model for currency shocks. Now, during this phase, anyway, the market access global pricing teams are now starting to look at trying to model the international reference pricing impact. But it gets that element much more complicated because we do have, at this stage, so many different SKUs that are in the market, different size of tablets, different indications, and there are different sort of pricing metrics that sort of go on and sort of that affect the in-market phase. But it's all sort of working together towards, what is the best strategic pricing decision, and an impact in a country, having the understanding that it's not just going to affect that country. It has the ability to affect a much wider halo of other countries that we need to consider for the full duration of the life cycle revenue management. So we've painted a picture about the complexity of international reference pricing, about the sort of countries that have reference baskets, and those reference baskets have different type of rules, and the application of those towards the launch planning, and also the application towards in-market revenue sort of a scenario planning as well. But now let's start looking at and building the story out, and John, you mentioned this anyway, is about the changing environment, about sort of the changing environment of international reference pricing sort of complexity. So policy surrounding international reference pricing is evolutionary. It evolves over time. And organizations such as IHS Markit, who partner with the SAS, and we do a great job of sort of working in partnership with them, and they do a fantastic job in keeping up with all the shape-shifting in policy that starts to take place, providing insight. And I have to thank them for allowing me to share just one of their slides in this presentation. It's taken from the International Reference Pricing Guidebook and just shows some of the trends in IRP policy. Within this, we start to see how the nature of the IRP formula is not a static category. It's evolutionary. It changes over time. Countries may start off with an average or a median of a pricing rule within a basket, but they could evolve to then taking on the lowest price of a reference basket. The reference baskets are dynamic as well. They are far from static. Different countries come in and go out over sort of time. And the size of reference basket, there is a sort of pattern towards increasing sizes of reference basket. And the final part is looking at the reference pricing rule, how the reference pricing rule is then sort of the frequency of where that rule is then gone out and sort of taken into consideration for pricing. So what we see is that, there is significant evolution. And if we start to think about it, countries that evolve by choosing the lowest price basket and increasing the size of the basket, increasing the frequency of which they're going to re-reference, those countries that adopt those policies and those principles will probably be best at sort of capturing all the sort of changes that are happening on a sort of global nature and being effective in sort of driving sort of global prices down. Now, another area of evolution is that countries that didn't engage previously in international reference pricing now starting to consider this application. And again, a sort of great sort of case and a great sort of reference happened just if we jump in the time machine and go back just 2 years to 2018, when our world was very much different from what we know today. But sort of looking at sort of the Center of Medicare and Medicaid Services making their proposal in 2018 about adopting international reference pricing for Medicare Part B sort of drugs. Now, within this policy, they were going to consult and sort of take an average of a basket of similar economies to the US and apply those prices for Medicare Part B drugs. Now, naturally, this took our attention anyway, and so working with IHS Markit, we modeled this out to see what the implications would be on some products, and published this report, the International Pricing Index Model Simulations. Now, within this model, what we could show is that, here is the de facto of looking at a brand and looking at what happens to the price. This would be the status quo within Medicare Part B. In that, so over time is that we'd see a stepwise, small increments, but always increments of that price sort of going forward. That would be the status quo. However, if this proposed rule sort of took place, then this would be the implications of this. We would see a stepwise change down in the price for all the products that would be under that sort of a portfolio. And that product would not just affect the United States anyway. It would, because of the connective nature of international reference pricing, would have the opportunity of spilling out into some other countries that directly reference the US, if this ever came through, and indirectly reference the US. So we can see that, this proposed rule was a first proposal in a step forward of, trying to sort of look for Medicare Part B of doing things differently. Now, last year, into September 2020, an executive order was put forward, and it's called the Most Favored Nation Executive Order. And so, again, IHS Markit wrote sort of in depth about the implications that this could have, about U.S. drug prices could be drastically impacted if this sort of came through. So what we've shown is that over a relatively short period of time is that, countries such as the US who, for part of the portfolio haven't engaged in international reference pricing are currently looking at this and trying to sort of figure out which is the best way forward. Now, we all know that we've got a new administration. Anyway, that was under the Trump administration. The new administration going forward, what's going to happen with that executive order? Does it get changed? Does it get modified? All that we can say is that, there seems to be a trend where, part of especially within Medicare, being able to look at the implications of adaptation of sort of pricing control factors. Okay, so moving on to the next part is trying to get a better understanding of the challenge. These are the real challenges that your colleagues within market access, the challenges that within global pricing, that have to undertake in trying to determine optimality of the launch sequences. So again, I just want to unravel this part of the of the discussion a little bit further. And to be able to do this, I want to illustrate it with an example. So imagine if we had a product and that we had a 60-month potential launch window and that we were going to launch that. And if we only launched that in one market, there were 60 different times where we could actually launch that time on a monthly calendar. There'd be 60 different dropping into points to launch that product. Now, obviously, you'd want to try and launch it as early as possible, but there would be 60 possible scenarios if you had a 5-year window, 60 months. Okay, as we start to factor in more and more countries, you can quickly see from this table how the problem quickly gets exponential. In fact, that we only need to get to 8 countries where we've got a total of 167 trillion. That's 167 trillion potential launch sequences to consider. Now, conceptually, each launch sequence has a value. It has a value because we've got a price that we're going to launch into each market. we've got the date in which we're going to launch, so we can start generating revenues. You've got the volumes that you'll start to achieve in terms of sort of forecast volumes. And then you've got the international reference pricing, which is then overlaid as the matrix to be able to sort of govern what happens to those prices in just those 8 sort of countries. But we all know that the reality in the sort of world that we work is that how many countries do we have on a sort of global launch? You're going to go for 50, 80, 100. And, you know, the problem then sort of we've shown you only need to get 8 countries at 167 trillion sequences. The problem just clearly explodes to unfathomable sort of methods of sort of how do we find that sort of launch sequence. It's like searching for a very, very valuable needle in a very, very, very large haystack. So how do companies do it at this moment in time? Well, there are 2 real techniques. You can't sort of, you know, make any guesses behind this. You have to use some statistical rigor. So option number 1 is relatively simple sort of exercise. It's called a simulation, where an algorithm is that we know roughly where the countries are that we want to launch and thinking about what is that launch order. But then we'll sort of rely on an algorithm, Monte Carlo simulation as an example here, which samples the solution space. And by sampling it, we're randomly going to choose samples of sort of launch sequences, and then we're going to do a calculation of that to be able to sort of determine what is the revenue associated with that launch. And as we can see here, sort of we can compute all of those blue dots. We arrive at the orange dot, the orange circle, which is the launch sequence that generates the most revenue. And by and large, this is a good answer. And sometimes it can be a very good answer. But the problem being is that it's not the best answer. And that bit between sort of, you know, hitting that launch sequence and what resides at the top of the apex there can translate over a product life cycle to be a very, very significant sort of figure. I'm going to explore that sort of on the next slide. So that's one simple technique. It's called simulation, exploring Monte Carlo simulations as an example. The other technique is about optimization, and this is a highly different analytical technique. It's a very highly sophisticated algorithm that has been purpose-built for the situation of determining launch sequence optimality. And essentially, you just let this run into the solution space, and it identifies what is the absolute peak of sort of a launch sequencing, and just determines and delivers the answer back with further insight to further reassure you of the sort of the decisions that it's made and the rationale behind those decisions. Now, in the real world setting, the value of launch sequence optimization is significant. We've been fortunate. We've probably worked with over 50 brands, bringing those, seeing the results of bringing this to market. And, we look at the additional potential that it brings. So, this graph is charting off all the different launch sequences on the x-axis with what is the revenue, what is the average price on the y-axis. And compared with simulation, optimization will always deliver this delta. It will always find amongst all of this, these trillions of launch sequences, a better launch sequence by navigating around the complexities of international reference pricing. And what that means is that, from our past experience, it can translate anywhere between tens to hundreds of millions of dollars within the launch phase itself, but also delivering a sustained, from our experience, 2 to 4% sustained improvement in global pricing at the end of the launch sequence. Okay, then, so what does that look like anyway? And this is just an extract from the solution. So we run this, we take the basic inputs, which is looking at which countries you're going to launch into, what is the launch date, your earliest launch date, what is the indicative launch price, what are the volume forecasts, and then to be able to overlay the international reference pricing matrix. And then we let the analytics run. Now, within this case, we show that, by running a simulation of this is a company's best plan of coming to the market. It was going to deliver revenues over the launch sequence of 1.19 billion, but optimization delivered a launch sequence that yielded an extra, close to 60 million additional revenue and that we could drive up the end price by a 7% in this case. What it then sort of looks like in sort of further details, and apologies, a very busy slide, but let me chunk it down so you can understand the story that exists here. So on the left-hand side, we've got all the individual countries in which you want to launch into. In this part of the table on the right-hand side, we've got all the simulation results. We look at the revenue, the date for launch, and sort of what was the proposed launch price. And then we then have a comparison of what the optimized optimized numbers are. So again, we've got the revenue, the dates, and the launch prices. And then the final part is what is the difference? Now, this difference is that when you undergo optimization, you have to make some sacrifices in that some countries would have to give up sort of revenues so that other countries could capitalize on on the ability of navigating through international reference pricing and trying to attain the prices that have been secured in those countries for as long as possible. That's the nature of the challenge ahead, trying to maintain those prices that have been attained for as long a period of time. But I want to come back to this part anyway, that amongst those countries that need to lose revenue as part of this process, we have to look at, that their timings of when we're going to launch into those countries is going to be absolute critical. So these areas that have just been highlighted to achieve optimality, given everything in this plan, we absolutely need to execute upon these launch dates that have been part of the optimized plan. And that is where the challenge is ahead. So in conclusion, just to be able to reflect on the last part of this discussion, we've shown that attaining optimality across the product life cycle is certainly it has a major impact across the whole of the product life cycle, and that by navigating through the complexities of reference pricing and trying to factor that further upstream in all the decisions that are starting to be made so that we can hit all the timelines that are required, well, the value is really significant if done right. But to be able to get there needs to be tighter integration, and that tighter integration between launch planning and clinical ops, because there are absolute critical deadlines that jointly need to be achieved. So both parties working together, having more insight about each other's processes and what they're working towards, can establish that plan about how to meet the end goals ready for that launch or optimization. In summary, launch planning, it shouldn't be something that's bolted onto the clinical trial ops. It's about establishing best practices for flawless integration and seamless integration and flawless execution of the launch plan. And the final part of this is then, acquiring the capability. What does it take to get launch sequencing optimization? Is it a hefty IT investment? Well, no, the good news is that, that this can be a very simplistic solution to be able to acquire, or to a simplistic consulting project in which to undertake. Again, the basic tenets of what required is that overlaying into the international reference pricing matrix about, which countries are being planned for launch, the proposed timing for launch, the existing or the thought of launch prices, and also the volumes that would be required. Being able to then make tweaks and modifications as we start going through, and these what-if scenarios. We thought we were going to launch in in the UK at this price. Well, here is the reality of the price. We're being able to now put that in and seeing if anything has happened towards that that launch sequencing, that you may need to start changing all the parameters. So reflections is about attaining price optimality, certainly, from our experiences, it's worthwhile sort of the exercise to be able to look at this, being able to bolt it further upstream into the clinical trial planning process, and and this can be sort of turned around in really a relatively short period of time. So, Kalina, I think that's. I've got to hand it back to you now. I just want to thank you for your attention throughout this, and I hope you found some of the perspectives of interest. And we look forward to having further discussion with you. Thanks, Kalina.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder for the audience: in order to ask any questions, you can send them in via the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top corner of your screen and click submit. But it looks like we've got some questions coming through already. So the first one for today is, reference pricing is only an issue in the EU, right?
I'll take that one. Yeah, thanks, Kalina. Well, it's certainly mature in the sort of the EU, but no, it is a global phenomenon. It is Middle Eastern, Asian markets, Canada, Latin America. And, it's not just a case of, where it's embedded and where it's mature and where it's been established as maturity. It's a reflection of what it has done on sort of controlling prices. And as a control mechanism, that more and more countries will be evaluating it as a sort of going forward. As a case example of what sort of Medicare did in the Most Favored Nations executive order.
Thank you very much. Another question that we have is, could you describe in more detail about the impact that U.S. IRP could have?
Well, the impact is that, as that one example showed, is that sort of modeling a product, and that was an in-market sort of a product, a product that has been fully launched, and we could see that, what are going to be the implications to the forecast, the new forecasts if IRP sort of came through. And the great news is that, we can simulate all of this and give companies back a true understanding. But I think where the exciting part needs to come is that if it did ever sort of establish itself as a part of the mechanism within the sort of US, then being able to sort of factor this within the US at the moment for launch sequencing, trying to get an understanding of any modifications that sort of needed to be made by the US being a sort of engaging in reference pricing, and the implications that some of the prices that sort of Medicare may have. And certainly going to be an interesting one to sort of watch and see where this evolves to. Thanks, Kalina.
Thank you very much. Another question that we have coming through is, considering the upcoming change in Canada regarding pricing by PMPRB, how do you see this change will impact the launch sequence in other countries? What about global pricing impact?
Yeah, well, changes are coming through all of the time. What is the implication of those changes is a great thing. Can't make any comments of kind of what it is at the moment because it would look different for every single sort of product and, what are the sort of prices in other markets, et cetera, and which are the markets they wish to be launched into. But again, the ability, I think it's a great question, but the ability to be able to model this anyway through the technology and then sort of get back a true understanding of the implications is something that could relatively easily be done.
Thank you very much. Another question that we have is, what are the basic requirements needed to model launch optimization?
Sorry, that was the basic requirements, Kalina.
Yes, indeed. What are the basic requirements needed to model launch optimization?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Okay, then so, the central tenets that we are sort of modeling anyway is that naturally, countries, in which countries are you going to launch into? What is the earliest launch date that you are going to sort of commence your sort of launch in those countries? Again, so a lot of this is being priced, is being placed on insight that is being derived from sort of a marketing authorization approval and sort of and the pricing and reimbursement sort of parts. So we've got to look at the earliest sort of what is your earliest launch date and then sort of for your price itself. You may want to start modeling parameters around that price. What is, especially if we're undergoing early phase. Sort of calculations here. This is a price, it may be 170, but what would be an upper limit that you would wish to, maybe, the negotiations haven't completed. And if you could try to get an upper limit, what would that be? What would the lower limit be that, an absolute floor that you don't want to sort of go below? You can put those parameters into the matrix as well. So as established, we're looking at sort of the countries first. We're looking at sort of the pricing, the price, and putting parameters around that. We also need to look at the volume forecasts and as best estimates that could have about, doesn't need to be absolute precise, trying to say 3 years down the line, or what is our forecast volume for a new launch product. It doesn't have to be a rocket science determination of this of the forecast, but just a rough indication given the size of the population, the disease population that you're going into. And then again, sort of being able to have the most up-to-date, such as those provided by IHS Markit, sort of a indication of what's happening to all the reference pricing rules that are going out there. Again, underwriting that this is dynamic, it's changing all the time, and to be able to subscribe to getting that insight. So if a reference basket does change, if a reference rule does change, you've got that insight to be able to model against. Thanks, Kalina.
Thank you very much. Another question that we have is, does it make sense to discuss pricing and market basket impact in phase 1, given the high failure rates seen in early-stage clinical development?
Yeah, I think, Patrick, I'll jump in on this one. I think that
sure.
that is a question on the table. We've seen that a lot of the folks commented in the poll that phase 3 seemed to be the time that their companies engaged more in this type of discussion. So is phase 1, is the high failure rates, that much of an impact? There are certain elements that we have to seek out and certain problems we have to solve for in phase 1 that are required of all products. So while they may not be absolute critical to the shaping of the commercial value of the product, they're necessary. But I think that the sooner you start having conversations around the project trial plan, the timing related to moving from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 in those markets, it just makes more sense, in my own personal opinion, that the better informed we are, the better we can make decisions around the selection of sites and the implementation of clinical development activities that would eventually lead us to an approval in a market. I think that is really the most important question to ask is phase 1 too early? I guess the counter question is phase 3 too late?
Thank you very much, John.
Yeah, John, sorry, Kalina,
if I
could just sort of make comment and reference to that. John, I couldn't agree more. From our experiences of doing this, most companies will start planning this in sort of a phase 3. But I am detecting a sea change. I think, the doors are now sort of open about, integrating this earlier on in the sort of the clinical trial planning process. So I think it's the door is now starting to open for earlier consideration. And I think it's, when you start modeling it out anyway, is that you start undergoing, sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And when you start unraveling this and start asking the questions about the impact, and start modeling it out, then sort of reality starts coming into focus, into vision, and starts driving. We can change the outcome and the future of this product life cycle, but we need to get in there early, and the more time we've got to plan and prepare for it, the better we are about having that flawless execution against this.
Yeah, agreed.
Thanks, Kalina.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Another question that we have is, the U.S. is 50% of the market for pharmaceuticals. Why shouldn't we just always launch there first?
Yeah,
so Patrick, I think I'll jump in first and let you give some thoughts on it.
Yeah, sure.
one of the values of what we're suggesting, and when you take in consideration the use of analytics, at the end of the day, you still may make that decision. It may still be that this is the market we're going to go into, but at least you're making a more informed decision, and you've taken a more exhaustive and maybe a more analytical look at what is and what can be. And it gives you information that you can use as you start to move forward in your discussion with the different governing bodies and different regulatory bodies in the different countries. But again, at the end of the day, that's a decision that has to be made by a company, and we see that. We see that sometimes you chase the easier indication or the least costly indication or least time-consuming indication to get to an approval so that you can at least get your drug platform proven, you can get a product on the market, and you can start benefiting patients who have a need for that particular pharmaceutical or technology. And then you start to reach out and expand its usage into other indications, other patient types, and other disease areas. So again, is it always the slam dunk and the easy course of action, go after your biggest market? At the end of the day, quite possibly. But again, if you're looking at more personalized medicine, as we start looking at subpopulations scattered around the world, that may not always be the best approach.
Yeah, John, if I could just make comments on that one too anyway. And again, this is reflecting on experience. And firstly, answering the question, head on, if the US was 50% of a sort of a predicted sort of global revenues, then to me, it absolutely, you do need to get that out into the market and as quickly as possible. However, if you start looking at it, what is the lifetime value of a whole of a sort of global launch? And, and then take the US out of the market and just look at the rest of the global theater, which will still sort of, if it is a blockbuster, it will still transcend into tens of billions of revenues over the lifetime. Tens of billions. And, and that is the figure that we're looking at and saying that, look, if we sort of drive through an optimization, that is the delta, driving those small percentage points through that we illustrated earlier is affecting that part of the delta. So, to me is that, even if the US was 50% and that you wanted to launch it into the US market first, still consider the wider tail of that global market, because driving through even small incremental gains could have still significant implications for the product life cycle. And we're at the stage now when we're looking at wringing every single last drop of value out of a decision, and being able to sort of bring analytics, some advanced analytics, to be able to determine what is that optimized launch sequence for the rest of the world. In this case, it's an exercise worth pursuing.
Thank you very much. Another question that we have is, how can a small team at a small biotech manage this? We currently have one marketing person who manages marketing, pricing, forecasting, market access, and launch planning.
And that sounds a very busy job, but a job that we can sort of relate to. And now we can really relate to this. Smaller companies compared to the sort of larger pharmaceutical companies that haven't got extensive pricing divisions. But the ability to be able, what are we trying to do anyway? We're trying to get an answer. We're trying to get an answer that will affect decisions going forward. So how can we do it if we haven't got this sort of the manpower to be able to do this? Well, this is where a consulting approach would sort of come in. Is that working in collaboration with a company such as ours is the ability then to be able to give us all of those parameters that we've just discussed before about the countries in which you want to launch into, the indicative prices, the earliest launch, what you think the forecasts would be, and then model it. And then here is a consulting report that sort of comes back. And then you've got that as your North Star that you want to start following. But you've got that as your North Star very early on in your global rollout. So I think that's how smaller companies that are that only have small staff for this can get access to this type of insight.
Thank you very much. this is all the time that we will have for questions in today's session, but a reminder for the audience that your questions will be available to be answered at a later date. So that just leaves me to thank John Musandi and Patrick Homer for this presentation and to QPS for sponsoring this session. To the attendees, you will receive an email shortly telling you how you can access the on-demand version of this webinar, or you can access this through our website, which is www.business-review-webinars.com. We look forward to sharing further webinars with you, so please do keep an eye on the website just mentioned, and you can also follow us on Twitter at BRWebinars for daily updates. Also, you can join our LinkedIn group, Business Review Webinars. Thank you all once again, and I hope that you have a great day.
Thank you.